Welcome back, comrades, to part 2 of Professor Jordan's Whys of History on why the Allies won in World War II. I hope you've got that narrative we talked about last time still fresh in your head, because we're about to blow it up. Part 2. Everyone forgets about the Russians. Before we get into how the USSR was stupidly vital to winning the war, let's look at how the presence of Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union throws a large fistful of wrenches into our narrative by hitting our
randomly relevant random fact
for this episode. While Britain and the US may have been standing up for freedom and democratic values and liberty, the USSR stood for literally none of those things. There was no more democracy in the Soviet Union than there was in fascist Germany or Italy, and Stalin was just as much a ruthless, power-hungry, totalitarian dictator as Hitler or Mussolini. In the usual narrative, we note the concentration camps and gas chambers of Nazi Germany, but tend to overlook the mass executions, gulags, forced relocations, and arguably intentional famines that killed millions upon millions over the course of Stalin's rule. In fact, depending on whose numbers you use, Stalin was, at best, responsible for as many deaths as Hitler, and at worst, Stalin doubled or even tripled Hitler's numbers. In short, Stalin had little to no objections to slaughtering his own people, and this character trait, along with the flexibility of the Soviet Red Army, was also integral to the victory of the Allies by stopping and stalling the seemingly unstoppable and unstallable German army. At the onset of the war, Germany and the USSR had signed a non-aggression treaty, and 2 weeks after Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, the USSR jumped on the bandwagon and Poland was split along lines that Hitler and Stalin had agreed upon before entering the war. Stalin followed this by expanding his control over Central and Eastern Europe, annexing Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and invading both Finland and Romania. While Stalin had hoped that a more permanent alliance could be made with Germany, negotiations between the two powers continually broke down in 1940 and 1941, making continued peace between the two powers seem shaky at best. On June 22, 1941, Hitler put Operation Barbarossa into effect, launching a full-scale invasion of the USSR, betraying the non-aggression pact and bringing the USSR onto the side of the Allies by default. Even though this attack was definitely not unforeseeable, it didn't make fighting the German army any easier. The German army, on the back of its massively successful blitzkrieg, and with better equipped and more experienced soldiers, trampled the Red Army in the first phases of the war. The USSR lost 750,000 soldiers in the first month of the war, and would lose another 600,000 in the Battle of Kiev alone in August of 1941. By the end of 1941, the Russian army had lost over 4.3 million men, with another 3 million men taken captive, or the combined equivalent of the current population of New York City. The defense of Leningrad would cost 3.5 million Soviet lives, many of whom were starved civilians, as the city was under siege for 2.5 years. Ultimately, despite defeat after defeat and setback after setback, the Red Army was able to slow the German advance, ultimately halting the German army less than 75 kilometers from Moscow in December of 1941. This was not only the first major defeat of the German army in the entire war, but it also stranded them in Russia during the winter, which is pretty much any army's worst nightmare. Upon invading the Soviet Union, Hitler estimated that he could attack the USSR with such speed and ferocity that the vastly inferior Soviet army would simply fall apart and wither away, allowing Hitler to take Moscow and secure his victory in just a few months, a strategy lovingly referred to as pulling a France. This time frame was vital, as Hitler didn't want to pull a Napoleon and get his army stuck in a hostile Russia when winter struck, which, unfortunately for Hitler, was exactly what happened. Even before winter set in, the German army found the Eastern Front to be incredibly hostile. Managing and supplying the German army over the vast Russian steppes was infinitely more difficult than fighting in Belgium or France. Soviet infrastructure wasn't much better. What little roads the Soviet Union actually had were more like dirt tracks that quickly turned to knee-deep mud in the rainy Russian autumn. And to top it all off, the Soviet army had a tendency to destroy anything they thought the Germans might get their hands on. As the Red Army retreated, they would destroy the land as they left, making it harder for the advancing German army to live off the land and maintain their vital time frame. This scorch and burn policy was sound strategy in the realm of fighting the Germans, but had the unfortunate side effect of using Soviet soldiers to pillage and burn Soviet farms, factories, towns, railroads, and equipment. Ultimately, the Red Army was able to suffer blow after blow after blow and continue to slow the Germans down, to the point where 7/8 of all the German soldiers killed during World War II were killed on the Eastern Front. Even with the destruction of large parts of Western Russia, the USSR was able to increase its military production over the course of the war, and eventually, following the horrific siege of Stalingrad in the fall of 1942, began to push the Germans out of Eastern Europe. By tying down and ultimately defeating the German army in the east, the Soviet Union made it possible for Allied victory in North Africa and Italy, which would prove to be a decisive turning point in the Western Front. Having just listened to that, you might be wondering how on earth the USSR could call that a victory, and the numbers are pretty staggering. The USSR would walk out of World War II with around 24 to 30 million people killed, at least half of that number being civilians, suffering the highest casualties of any country in the war by a pretty serious margin. The USSR would lose around 15% of its total population, and it was said that 1 in every 4 people in the Soviet Union was killed or wounded during the war. On top of this, 70,000 Soviet cities, villages, and towns of all shapes and sizes were destroyed during the conflict. Stalin's role in this mess is very mixed, as his decision to relocate factories away from the fighting and his scorch and burn tactics were vital in the Red Army's adaptation and success, but at an enormous cost. Not only were Stalin's strategies utterly devastating to much of his own country, but Stalin's mass executions of both political prisoners and POWs was horrific in its own right. Stalin is also credited with reforming the management of the Red Army, a move that drastically improved its fighting capabilities, though it was Stalin's own purges and policies that made the army such a mess in the first place. In fact, one of the ways Stalin managed to keep the Red Army from falling apart was by ordering that any Soviet soldier that so much as mentioned desertion or surrender could be shot on the spot. Oh, and their families would be shot or imprisoned as well. Oh, and that rule applied to anyone who was even suspected of thinking about deserting or surrendering. Ultimately, while all those things I talked about in part 1, the American production, the Allied cooperation, and the Allied bombing, all helped ensure Allied victory in World War II, Stalin and the immense sacrifice of the USSR was also extremely vital. And while historians debate whether or not Germany ever really could have defeated the USSR, the defeat of the German army at the hands of the Soviet Union played a massive role in deciding the outcome of World War II. Part 3. Jordan makes you think about stuff, and it's not happy stuff. Just when you thought I might be done talking about horrific suffering and the death of people in numbers I think anyone in our age has trouble truly grasping, we have to reflect on this a bit. Like I said in the beginning of part 1, I think one of the reasons we all love World War II is because of how beautifully it creates a story that we can connect to, yet it is one that tends to blur the complications and shades of gray one often finds when studying history. I think we all want to feel like this was a time in history where the good guys truly did defeat the bad guys, where the sides were clearly black and white and the world clearly walked out the better after so much suffering and sadness and sacrifice. And while the world certainly would have been worse off if the Allies had lost the war, it's definitely a become a monster to fight a monster theme when looking at this conflict. It's easy to focus on the horrors of the gas chambers at Auschwitz and the slaughter of Nanking, or the valiant sacrifice at D-Day or Iwo Jima, and simultaneously make side notes of the thousands of people who suffocated in Dresden because the firestorm was so great it literally consumed all the oxygen for miles around, or the American scientists who spent time developing the best ways to light Japanese houses on fire, or the fact that one of the key players on the side of good was a totalitarian dictator with the blood of tens of millions on his hands. Not only does a large focus on this narrative lose a lot of the gray area, but it also tends to warp one's perspective of the issue. As a great example, I mentioned in the very beginning that all of the civilians killed during the Battle of Britain were only double the number of people killed in Dresden, Germany alone, and each atomic bomb killed more civilians than were ever lost in Britain. The United States would lose a little over 400,000 people in World War II, a number that seems almost statistically insignificant compared to the 7 to 9 million Germans killed, or the roughly 3 million Japanese killed, or even compared to its allies like China, who lost between 10 and 20 million people, or Poland, who lost 5.7 million, or British India, who lost between 1.5 and 2.5 million. Not counting colonies, neither Britain, France, nor the United States even hits the top 10 in total casualties. I belabor these sobering and depressing numbers to try and reinforce the idea that it's somewhat dangerous to see an event like World War II as being one where the good guys are destined to win. While I've spent most of this episode talking about how and why the Allies won, it's worth noting that this war was certainly not predetermined, even if the numbers suggest the Allies had an advantage. After all, France had one of the largest empires in the world, and it fell to Germany just as quickly as minor powers like Poland and the Netherlands did. Britain was just a bad air skirmish or two away from a possible naval invasion. The United States was a hemisphere away from any of the fighting and was not mobilized for war when it was attacked. But the Russian army had to regularly sustain losses in the hundreds of thousands just to slow the German advance. Finally, in the vein of grade morality and all that, I want to hit on one final point that I find ever so fascinating about World War II, and I think this point is another reason why we all prefer the simple narrative. It's the idea that World War II helped bring about the end of the belief/idea that Western civilization, or Europeans and their descendants, was/is truly the pinnacle of modern civilization. For hundreds of years before World War II, Western civilization went forth and conquered and converted and killed and altered and affected just about every place and people on Earth, all based on the idea that Western culture and values and economics and politics and institutions are worth spreading, and that all people, at least in one way or another, benefit from this forced conversion. Nowadays, the notion that Africans or Central Americans or Indians should be thankful for the bountiful gifts of Western civilization is an idea that will probably get you punched by a lot of people, and I'd argue World War II has a fair amount to do with that. While many non-Europeans across the globe may have been oppressed and/or controlled, the heaping pile of hypocrisy and irony that was World War II, and to a degree World War I, did not escape them. The powers that claim to be so enlightened, so scientific, so rational, so Christian, spent half a decade literally blowing each other to hell, only 30 years after they spent another half decade blowing each other to hell. I mean, how could Western civilization really claim to be morally superior to somewhere like Africa, after one side used characteristically Western scientific rational procedure to systematically exterminate millions of their own people, and the other side used those same skills to wipe entire cities off the map? How could the USSR or Britain really argue that Germany had no right to invade Poland or Czechoslovakia or France when the USSR simply took over all the territory in Eastern Europe it liberated from the Germans, and Britain owned all of India and then some, most of Oceania, half of the Middle East, chunks of the Caribbean, chunks of China, and 2/3 of Africa? How could the United States really be standing up for freedom and democracy when they didn't even grant basic rights to a sizable number of their own people, and spent years developing the most powerful weapon in history, which they then dropped on civilians, who had basically no say in their government or their circumstance? And the argument could be made that the ferocity of the war forced everyone's hand into acting the monster to defeat the monster, but that begs the question of how the nations who supposedly represented the zenith of civilized society could let the war get to that point in the first place. The good guys always win narrative that I presented at the beginning doesn't deal with this issue. It doesn't force people like me or Sam to think about the lengths that our grandparents' generations went to achieve victory. It doesn't discuss the fact that World War II was not an inevitability and was a result of both decisions made by leaders and people over generations and issues that they never resolved. It heavily notes the accounts of one tyrannical dictator, but often ignores the accounts of another. It removes the suffering and intensity, makes clear the muddled and makes certain the ambiguous. At the end of the day, I can think of no worse way to remember the most horrific event in human history than to boil it down into something that is so clear-cut and black and white that we can't learn anything from it. Thank you very much for watching. Please feel free to subscribe, like us, favorite us, share us to all your friends, as well as like us on Facebook. And if you need more incentive, here's a kitty. I appreciate your time. I am Professor Jordan, and I will see you all next class. You good? Yeah. Can you see him? Yeah. Okay. Be sure to like us, subscribe, favorite us, share us. Try that one more time. No, you gotta stay here. No, come here. Scratch him the right way. This is your one moment. This is your one shot. Here, no! If I hadn't messed it up.